I believe this is the most important book on Bantu religion. And I'm talking about a book titled Bantu Beliefs and Magic, published in 1922, a while back. And I've read this book and very amazed at the things that are in the book. Now, we are going to read notes that I wrote about the book. And this is, of course, this is a public property book. And I decided to make it available as a physical book, and I wrote a new introduction to it, especially giving it a perspective, because this book was not written for Africans. It was not written for Bantus, whoever considers themselves to be Bantu. This was written for other people. Now, let's read this introduction. This book is about Bantu people, but it was not written to be read by the Bantu or even Africans in general. It was written by a senior colonial administrator in Kenya in the 1920s, with fellow British colonial administrators and academicians as the targeted readers. The book is a product of a very meticulous study of African societies that the colonizers were working tirelessly to drastically change. And that's a part that we forget. And it's becoming very clear to me that when the British came to Kenya and other Europeans came to Africa, they wanted to change the society, and they started to study the societies so that they could find ways to change them. That becomes very clear when you read this book, that there was a lot of effort that went into studying the African religions so that they can take them away from the people. And changing the African societies took a lot more than we imagine today. Actually, when you see the work that the writer put in, and not just him, and he wrote several books, I've read 3 of his books, you realize that this was a huge project. And in fact, in another book, he talks about exactly that, the plans to change society and the need to study the people very carefully. As evidenced by the details in this book, it was important for the European colonizers to understand the intricacies of how the African societies functioned. Actually, Charles William Hobley, the author, doesn't shy away from making it apparent that it was necessary to understand the African in detail in order to have a strategy that would efficiently dismantle his then existing very complex constitutions. In fact, he uses the word constitution, and replace them with European authority and governance. By reading this book, you will not only understand how the African society was organized before colonization, but also the mindset of a colonizer as they worked towards changing that society from being independent and sovereign to being subservient and a source of value for the British establishment. This book is written by Charles William Hobley, who came to Kenya in 1890 as a member of staff of the colonial British East Africa Company. When the company wound down and handed over the East Africa Protectorate to the British government, he joined the civil service. His first posting was Mumias, where he served as a district commissioner, and he later rose to become a senior provisional commissioner. Other stations where he served include Kisumu, Naivasha, Nairobi, Mombasa. In total, he stayed in Kenyan colony for over 30 years. During this period, he built a reputation as an officer who understood the African more than most. And I've read Sir Charles Eliot's book, The East Africa Protectorate, and Sir Charles Eliot was the very first senior British officer sent to Kenya to be in charge of the protectorate. And he mentions Hobley to be a very reliable scholar of the African. Wherever he was posted, he created relationships with people, learned the languages, culture, and history. Other British officials who wrote books about the East Africa Protectorate have cited him as a reliable source. Besides this book, Hobley also wrote The Ethnological Survey of Eastern Uganda, in which he provides a detailed description of communities found in what was then known as Eastern Uganda, the land from the present Uganda-Kenya border up to Naivasha. He also wrote Kenya from a chartered company to a crown colony, where he tells the beginning of the republic we know today as Kenya in a very interesting manner. This book covers 2 communities, the Akamba and the Agikuyu. Hobley states that the Akamba elders were relatively open and gave him what he needed without too much difficulty. Where he ran into problems was among the Agikuyu, who were not willing to share secrets about their culture, customs, and beliefs, especially to the uninitiated. At some point, the Agikuyu elders themselves urged him to be formally initiated into the community so that they could impart full information without violating the rules forbidding the sharing of ceremonial knowledge with those not of the appropriate grade. He does not disclose how high up he rose in the initiation hierarchy, which suggests that he may he may not have accessed the deepest knowledge. Now, this is important because the Kikuyu will share information to somebody the higher up they went in the rank, and you needed to be initiated again and again and again in rank, so that you get, the more initiation you went through, the more knowledge you received. And this is not just Kikuyu, it's most so-called Bantu communities is the same. You don't just get information because you want it, you get information because you qualify to get that knowledge. So Hobley tells us that he chose to be initiated, but he does not mention how high up he went. And that's important because there's another anthropologist now, an anthropologist, the Leakey, from the Leakey, I think it's Louis Leakey, who also got initiated among the Kikuyu, and he wrote a book that is very popular, The Southern Kikuyu. For him, he says he was initiated, but he said he reached a certain level and he was told, you cannot go beyond here, and this is the end of you. So because you are not born native, you cannot be initiated beyond here. And he acknowledges that most likely there is information that he never got because he never reached the right rank in the initiation. He also relied heavily on a Swahili interpreter named Juma bin Hamis, a coastal native who had lived among the Kikuyu, had been deeply trusted by them, and had become interested in the research. Juma bin Hamis died in Nairobi in 1911. Of course, there will always be a likelihood that Hobley and bin Hamis did not get everything correctly. They could have been misled or biased in how they recorded what they received. While it is true that many European scholars of this period had an agenda of portraying Africans in a negative light, we should acknowledge that this book was not written for Africans or even the general British public, and that's important. It was written for administrators and academicians, an audience that prioritized accuracy over propaganda. That means there is a high likelihood the writer did not intentionally misrepresent facts as he understood them, and that he did as a thorough research as was possible for him. That said, the book is most likely not without inaccurate ideas. Writers like Hobley generally processed ideas within what can be called the racial hierarchy framework. That means the idea he encountered were interpreted and presented to fit into the belief that some races were superior to others. That alone must have hugely impacted how he presents the knowledge he collected about the Agikuyu and the Akamba. It is also important to know that the Agikuyu and Akamba were republics, and that becomes apparent especially when he describes their governance structure. However, Hobley, like most Europeans of this time, found it so difficult to acknowledge these and numerous other commonwealths in Africa as republics. They would rather call them tribes, which fits well with the racial hierarchy framework. Tribes is clearly part of the cheapening language that they found useful in describing African societies. It is used for the same effect with words like warriors instead of soldiers and council of elders instead of senates. It was important for Europeans of this era to prefer these choices of words when describing African societies. For the same reason, they didn't acknowledge republics but only a few monarchies in the continent. It was a language that provided an excuse, especially in less enthusiastic public back at home, about colonizing others. It provided the moral cover for spreading enlightenment. I invite you to read this book with an open mind, and if possible, find other sources, especially those created by the Agikuyu and the Akamba scholars, so that you get to understand the ideas in right context. I added a chapter takeaway, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the most important points. Some things that I found interesting enough to note as the takeaway, so you might not find them to be interesting. Meanwhile, there are ideas that I did not include in the chapter takeaways that you are likely to find the most insightful. So read the book yourself. Now let's look at some of the notes that I made and this I added as chapter takeaways at the end of each chapter. And for example, chapter 1, I have an average Kikuyu Kamba did not know core of the Bantu beliefs. This is something that comes up, and I found it to be very interesting. But it makes a lot of sense that the average Kikuyu, and as I wrote, Kikuyu is a republic, Akamba was a republic. The average citizen did not understand the deep meanings of things. It is only those who had been initiated who will understand some things, and that's why you'll find that some knowledge was only known to very senior members of the society or the oldest members of the society. And then there is a note about African communicate with spirits because they are at a lower plane. Now, this is an assertion that Hobley makes, which is very weird and awkward because today you will agree that, or you will think that if you are going to talk to the spiritual world, you have to be on a higher plane. But he makes that assertion because he could not understand some phenomenons that were happening. And he decided to be like, the reason why Africans can speak to the spirit world and we cannot is because they are at a lower plane. And he makes that claim actually. Now, another takeaway, the link between Akamba and ancient Assyrian beliefs. Now, this is a very interesting link he creates. And he says that there are very interesting links between ancient Assyrians and the Akamba of Kenya. And he was trying to figure out how did it happen that these people have the same story about the spirit and the same practices as the ancient Assyrians. Another one is how dead Akamba man will marry. That's a story he tells. Why the Agikuyu and Akamba left trees standing when clearing land for agriculture. I found this to be very, very interesting because it's something that I've observed. Moving around Kenya, you'll find these lands that have been cleared for farming. But then you find out that there is that tree at the center. And I never used to even think about it, but it was like, why was that tree left behind? But there is a very spiritual meaning to it, and the Agikuyus and the Akamba understood it, and there are things that they will do with the trees. And he explains very interesting stuff about trees having spirit, and that is the belief that the Agikuyu had that trees are living things, they have spirits, and when you cut them down, you have to be mindful of those spirits and where are they going. He talks about other objects, the objects that the Agikuyu and the Akamba thought of to be sacred. He talks about a very interesting concept, and this is the scapegoating. Now, if you've read the Bible, you might know what is scapegoating. If you've not read the Bible, you might struggle a bit. And scapegoating is this concept of taking a goat, doing some rituals, and having the sins of people, could be the community or individuals, go into that goat, and then the goat is left to go into the wild. It is described in the Bible. Turns out the Kikuyu had almost exactly the same thing of scapegoating, taking a goat, giving it the sins of the community or the village, and then driving it into the wild. I also have a note on how the British used the African prophecies or prophecies by African prophets to justify the colonization. And these are stories that are very common around. If you hear, oh, this prophet prophesies that they are going to become these white people. And Hobley writes a part where it's like the Europeans actually liked those stories. Those stories gave them legitimacy to some extent. And there's a note about a plant that the Kikuyu believe to represent evil, very interesting. And then there's a story it tells about Europeans who would have to deal with spiritual matters because they did not listen to the locals. For example, there is one gentleman, a British guy, who went and built a house next to a sacred tree, a fig tree, I think. And he was told, you're not supposed to build a house next to a fig tree that the Kambas take to be very sacred. And he did. And then he could not live there because at night his house was terrorized by these spirits and he had to leave. And Hobley says that he came to believe that actually those things were happening because otherwise, how do you explain that? There is a note about the two primary ways the Kikuyu performed sacrifices, and they are very similar to how they are done or described in the Bible, which is very interesting. And in fact, there is a note where I ask, do these sacrificial practices prove that the Agikuyu and the Akamba are ancient Israelites? And in fact, Hobley himself does wonder. And he also provides biblical verses that match these practices among the Agikuyu and the Akamba. And he also talks about the Agikuyu and the Akamba worshipping one God and their ancestors and things like that. And then there is a note I make about how the Agikuyu and Luya, which is another Bantu community, how they memorized they are moving from the north. And this is very important, especially if you follow how most Bantu communities in Kenya describe how they arrived in Kenya. Most of them will say we came from the north, but the academic documents tend to always disagree and say, oh, they came from the west, which is based on this talk of the Bantu migratory patterns or whatever. But now the Hobley puts down a note or tells us about the Kikuyu having specific practices, especially when building a new village, to memorize that they came from the north. I have a note about how somebody will be adopted in Kikuyu Republic. The Maasai formed a large section of the citizenry of the Kikuyu, which is very interesting because today we think the Maasai are Nilotic, and the Agikuyu are Bantu. But turns out among the Agikuyu there was a huge section of the people who had Maasai origins. It is not about the Itwika, which is like the highest organ of political organization of the Agikuyu, and also spiritual actually, and only the elders who had been we could initiated at the highest level would attend the meetings, which would be held, I think, once every generation. I think, if I might be wrong, but he does explain. I think it's once every generation they will have this one meeting where new initiates will be trained by older gentlemen who are about to pass on the give them the secret knowledges of the people. Of course, I have where I ask whether, because Hobley says it, that the Akikuyu and the Maasai were led by a secret society. They tweak among the Akikuyu, and there's a name he calls it among the Maasai, that there were these secret societies where the senior most members of the society, especially in terms of age and initiation, will be initiated into, and they will not disclose anything, the information they got from it. There's a note about the olive trees and how sacred they were among the Akikuyu and the Maasai. Then there is a note about the age sets and age groups, and Obley goes into that, which is a very interesting part of the organization of the Akikuyu and the Akamba. And in fact, not just those two, the Maasai, the Kalenjin, all East Africans most often have that element of age set system. He has a chapter, and I make a note, I don't think whether I made a note about this, about the Ahu, which is like sin. I don't know whether sin is actually the right word, and how it will be transferred and how people will be purified. I also have a note about how he describes how the Akikuyu will do a will in a traditional way. Of course, today people go to the lawyer and have it right. But the Akikuyu had their own way of doing a will. And after reading this book, I asked around and I understood some aspect of Nairobi that have always perplexed me. There are these very prime lands in Nairobi that you would expect would have been sold and very expensive houses built, but they have not. The people are not willing to sell. Turns out these are lands that are tied through this traditional will. I have a note on separating religion from the state, and here, from reading Hobley's text, it becomes very clear that the African societies, the Bantu society, the Akikuyu and the Akamba in specific, and this applies to most African society, commonwealths or republics for the most part, it was impossible to separate religion from the state. Like, it's nearly impossible. When you look at it carefully, you realize that it doesn't even make sense that you can separate religion from the state. And I'm speaking as somebody who, of course, prefers state not to have religion come into it politics. But yeah, you look at it, you are like, humans live more harmoniously when they live in a society where their religion matches very well with their political organization. I talk about the formation of the Court of Appeal of the Agikuyu Republic. Hobley discusses this, and then I summarize it in a note. The very unique form of blood money. The Agikuyu used to have a blood money system, just like the Somalis and other societies of East Africa. There used to be death penalty laws, which is very interesting. It's not like today if somebody murders another and some countries will, of course, kill them. The Kikuyus did not do that. But they had a very interesting way of curing such offenses. There is the pre-colonial Akamba Republic, elaborate oath of office, how the Akamba used to do the oath of office. Now, there is a chapter where he talks about the Agikuyu Akamba beliefs and rituals about lunar and solar eclipses. The Kikuyu and the Akamba thought of lunar and solar eclipses in a certain way, and they connected it to the spiritual existence. In the Agikuyu Republic, could apply to change their clan. Men in pre-colonial Agikuyu Republic used to have personal signatures, which I found to be very interesting, that each man, after initiation, maybe the first initiation, will have their own signature. And this signature combined the clan signature and their personal signature. And if somebody looked at it, they will know this is a signature of somebody from this clan. And maybe if they knew the person, they will know this is the signature of so and so. I also have a note where I talk about Hobley covering the position of women in the Agikuyu society and also Akamba. And he says that initially when you entered into that society, you'll think that the women had no say, but he slowly came to find out that actually the women had a lot of power, and even the men feared them. The men will have these conversations about the politics, but then in the end they will have to do according to how they think the women would approve, and sometimes the women will disapprove the decisions they've made. Now, there is a chapter where he talks about the abolition of African constitutions in existing African republics. And this is a very interesting part of his book. And he tells you about that plan of we need to, these people have their own constitution that is working. How do we take it away and give them? And he also goes ahead and talks about the negatives that happened when they took away the constitution of African. They created confusion, and he actually talks of confusion, where the young people did not know whether to follow the old constitution or the new constitution. And he talks of crime increasing, especially in people who had moved to urban centers where the old constitutions were no longer in operation. And he says it was so weird that the Africans who had moved to the urban centers like Nairobi would engage in crime a lot. But those who remained in what was called the reserves, and these are lands that were set aside for the people to continue living the way they used to live, there was hardly any crime. And that's very interesting. He talks about the UK government working with Christian missionaries to try to change society, which is very interesting. When you read, you're like, okay, this is very interesting, including subdividing the land into regions and giving each mission, you are the ones to go and evangelize there and stay there, and that will be your region. This, and today when you look at Kenya, you see that map. Actually, you see to certain places and certain brand of Christianity is the prevalent one. You go to another part, it's a different brand of Christianity. Turns out this did not happen by accident. This was actually something that was sanctioned by the government of the UK, then the colonial government in Kenya. There is a discussion about education and how it wasn't meant to help the African become better. It's a very interesting conversation he has there. And you look at it and you wonder what was happening then and what is probably happening today that we don't know is happening. And then there are conversations like the illusion of colonization. You read this book and you realize that actually the British understood that what held up colonization was perception. It wasn't force, it was perception, how the African perceived the European. And it was so important to maintain that perception. And you see it and you're like, this is very interesting. And I think the same thing happens today. There are structures that are in place, and they are held in place not by anything but perception. You can get a link to the book in the description box. You can go check the book. You can get a copy for yourself, a physical copy. This is, I think, the most important book on Bantu religion. Very important. It will give you a perspective of the Bantu religion and knowledge about the Bantu religion that is hardly not found anywhere, because the Bantu religion was so prevalent in late 19th century, 20th century. But Christianity came in and we lost this. Today, if you found even very old people, they know very little about the traditions and the religious practices of the people before colonization. Those are my random thoughts.